How many times have you been looking at a different brand of machine and seen a decorative stitch you wish you had on your own machine? On the Pfaff Performance 5.2, there is a Stitch Creator feature, and it's this icon right down here. And what we can actually do is create our own stitches. So for example, duplicating something you see on another machine. So we can I'm going to just delete off what I was playing with and start from scratch with a little grid work and insert stitches as we would desire and be able to place them at any intervals up to 9 millimeters wide, which is pretty incredible. Now, I would suggest taking some time and watching how a stitch is to be sewn if it's one from another machine, or take a little graph paper maybe ahead of time and sketch out the stitch in the order it would need to stitch before starting to place some of your stitches. But before we get going into starting from scratch, one thing that you can do is start with stitches that are already in your machine and maybe change them up a little bit or use an element and build on it. One of the things I do like about this machine, and I'm going to show you now to start with, is we're going to use from the decorative stitch category number 2 and stitch number 3. So when this stitch stitches out, it just stitches as a normal single line decorative stitch. So as you can see, it's not as bold as this one here. In the Stitch Creator, you can open a stitch. Actually, first I got to open the Stitch Creator, then go get our stitch. So touch our stitch we want, and it brings it in. So these are all the stitch points that is programmed into making this stitch. One of the options to make it bolder or triple stitch is just right here. It says 3 times. You touch it, it takes the stitches, and now it's going to do a triple stitch over each one of it, making it look much bolder. All you have to do is touch the check mark, and there's your stitch ready to stitch out. If you want to save this stitch, you can go ahead and save it into your personal menu. I already have, oh no, I haven't saved that one. I was playing with it earlier though. But that's a stitch that you could do and take any of the stitches and create it. So what we also have, let's start with this stitch here. This is from, so I'm going to open up our Stitch Creator, delete out anything we want. So I'm touching and holding the trash can and confirming with the check mark. I'm going to bring in stitch number from our 3rd category here of needle art stitches, group 2 and stitch number 6. So as you can see, it brings in one element of this stitch. And I was playing around and I actually created a new stitch with it. Now when I first started stitching it out, I did notice it was really close together. So towards the end, I was lengthening out the stitch and making it look more usable, I'll say, because this was really heavy. So let me show you how I created this stitch from this stitch. So I started off with the element of the single repeat, and I actually just went ahead and pushed it over to the side. Now, how did I come up with this? Well, I just opened up the pattern and thought, well, what if I duplicated it? I see a second one. Well, what if I moved it over here? And so as I moved it over, I see that there's another line of stitching that kind of followed, because that was where it ended and where it connected to the new one. So as I moved it up to kind of touch, and you can do this, you can move it on screen like this, but if you want to kind of inch it right to where that needs to go so it's nice and even, you can use the little arrows up and down. So right now the whole part is selected, and I'll show you how we can select parts and move or duplicate just certain areas. Now if I do the green check mark, I do see that the pattern looks a little filled in on one side, but not as filled in on the other side. So I might want to go ahead and add some stitches. So let's go ahead, and you can see where the stitch is going to end. So it's kind of back here, all right, and then it kind of goes back and forth, and then it comes over around. So you kind of have to know how it's going to actually stitch. So I went ahead, and with my stitch point at the very end, I added a stitch, and I'm going to bring that back over here and place it. Now it's a little sideways, so if I arrow down, I can get it right where I needed. But I could also zoom in. Whatever stitch point is selected, that's what it's going to zoom in on, so you can really see or get close to that. That's a great way to kind of be able to work around that part of it. Okay, so I have my stitch point moved up there. I'm going to add one more, and this time I'm going to bring that over here. So now it looks a little bit more like the top part or the left side that I already have created. Let's see, can I zoom out? Yep, not too far. There you go. And get it back into place. So you can toggle between zooming in and then back to being able to put your stitch point. So if I do the check mark, I can see that I'm starting to have some stitches. Now, when I started stitching, the stitches, because they're triply stitched anyway, that's what really made it look very squished when I was stitching it. So I went ahead, and by lengthening it out to the maximum length that it allowed me to, the 9mm long by 9mm wide, then I ended up with this stitch. Now, there's no ending to the amount of things that you could do with these stitches, so you are going to just need to take some time to play, and that's what I kind of did prior to doing this video, is I just sat and started playing with stitches. So I do like to start with stitches that already exist. Kind of gives me a place to start. If I want to, yep, all right. So then if I want to save that stitch, I could go ahead. I have already saved it, but if I was a new stitch, I could just pick a new area. And where are we saving those to? If you recall, we have a heart in our category 7, and I've been putting them in my menu 1. So there they are. So if I just want to go back to the first one I made, that's ready to stitch. If I want to go back to the last one I just did, it's ready to stitch. And we're ready to go. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm going to go back into my stitch creator, and I'm going to delete what I've done because I know I've already saved that. Delete all stitches, confirm with that. And let's play around with something else. So we're going to come in with an empty stitch creator. We can go bring in another stitch, and this one was back at category 4. Here we go. Number 2 and stitch 3. Okay. So I'm going to show you how I went from this stitch to this stitch. Now it was triply, I did add some triple stitches, and you can see it's kind of a little not perfectly symmetrical. One side's a little higher, it's kind of a little awkward looking, and that's because I didn't get the grid, the patterns exactly lined up on the grid as I was going. So let me show you what you can do with this area here, and this is for selecting stitches. So if I touch it, everything deselects, and what I'm seeing here is that my stitch point is on the last stitch of the 35 stitches it took to stitch this. If I arrow back, at any place within here, I could insert a stitch. So if I wanted to add a new stitch, I could. I'm going to just touch delete so I don't have to add anything. But what I can do is also select stitches. So I'm going to move back from where I was and then touch the, what is that called? That one is called selecting a stitch point. All right, but by selecting it, I can now move forward, and it's selecting all the stitches in this leaf. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the middle stem and then back. All right, so those are selected. If I want to duplicate that or even move it, so right now you can see by it being selected, it's movable. So I'm going to bring that back to the middle. So if I wanted to maybe change this to, instead of 2 petals, I want to make it 4 petals, then I can just duplicate those stitches. And then now I can insert it where I want it. So I can move it around, but I can use the mirror images to create. So how about that one's going to go down here. I can move that back to kind of the center point. And each one of those little grids is a 1mm on your fabric. So if I want to duplicate that again, I could just hit duplicate, and then I'm going to mirror image it so it comes over here. Ooh. And see, this is where I kind of got in trouble. I went ahead and left it a little high, so I'm going to bring it down so it's a little bit more even with that other point. There we go, kind of along that line. And if I want to see how that's going to look when it stitches out, I still got a couple not totally lined up, but that's kind of cool. Look how fun it is to actually create your own stitches. And if I want to go ahead and select everything, you can touch and hold that selection little check mark. And then if I wanted to go ahead and make it a triple version, and that's kind of what I did, was I made it a heavier version of what it started with. So we added 2 petals and then made it thicker, and when I go to sew it, it's ready to stitch. Again, you'll need to test it out, save the ones you want, delete the ones that don't turn out just right, but you definitely can have some fun. How about let's just do one more, and this is when, this is how the stitch started. So let's go ahead, I'm going to go back into my stitch creator, delete everything, confirm with the check mark. So we'll start with the blank screen. And this stitch was in my 4th category and group 3. And I was just looking, I saw this stitch number 12, all right? So I brought it in, and I just thought, well, what if I didn't want the last 2 squares in here? Now, this is a triples version as it was saved. So what I'm gonna do is just uncheck, and I can see my stitch, right now I'm on stitch 57 of all 57 stitches. So if I wanted to, I could even just kind of be delete, delete, delete. And it doesn't look like I'm deleting anything because it's actually 3 times there. And then once it gets all around 3 times. Okay, so that's one way to delete, is just to delete the stitches you don't want. And what I did for this one is I just left the top 2 little diamonds on there. So if I just wanted to highlight that big one all the way around 3 times, but I would know that because I needed to, sorry, I have to select before I go. All right, get all the way to the end, select, then highlight 3 times. And if I go past I went past, I can just back up and then touch delete, and then the whole thing rolls there. Now, when this stops, right now, stitch number 28 is right up here. So let's look. It's going to have that little jig if we left it there. And that's because the last stitch point, so it's stitched around, but the last stitch point was here. So I do need to add one more stitch point to bring me back to like the ending point. So I'm going to get that right close to where I want it to be. There we go. And then now it's going to be all lined up. So that's how you can start to play with the stitches that are already in your machine, and also duplicate something you see on another machine, or start from scratch. I'll just delete all this, delete all stitches, and start to place your points. So as I place a point, I can move it. I'm just inserting a point. I'm not making anything, obviously, but I could go ahead and make something there and then see what it's going to look like. Obviously nothing crazy and fun, but I could come back in and that could be a start of something that I'm wanting to create. So being able to come back in, you can insert stitches. So if you want to insert something, just like you would almost like typing on a computer, you can insert, you can select an area and duplicate it, and it will insert it in. There's just no limit to what you can do with the Stitch Creator. And this is kind of how Pfaff created their stitches, is on kind of this, you might say, plotting type system. Somebody created all the stitches that are built into the machine. So why do you need to stop with just what's built in? Now you can continue and create even more stitches. So have some fun with your Stitch Creator. You can double check your manual with maybe a quick how-to, what some of these functions are, and remember your question mark can always answer some of those questions, like what was that again, when you touch it and then touch an icon.